Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 24 March 2024. It is the 105th anniversary of the birth of Robert L. Heilbroner, who was born in New York City on this date in 1919. Heilbroner's best-known work is a book about the history of economic thought. The Worldly Philosophers, the Lives, Times, and Ideas of the Great Economic Thinkers, originally published in 1953, and which has probably been used in countless economic courses ever since. At the beginning of the book, Heilbroner writes, quote, "This is a book about a handful of men with a curious claim to fame. By all the rules of schoolboy history books, they were non-entities. They commanded no armies, sent no men to their deaths, ruled no empires, took little part in history, making decisions. A few of them achieved renown, but none was ever a national hero. A few were roundly abused, but none was ever quite a national villain. Yet what they did was more decisive for history than many acts of statesmen who basked in brighter glory, often more profoundly disturbing than the shuttling of armies back and forth across frontiers, more powerful for good and bad than the edicts of kings and legislatures. It was this: they shaped and swayed other men's minds," unquote. You could say that the method of this book, like Will Durant's very successful The Story of Philosophy from a Generation Earlier, published in 1926, is to write the history of economic thought as represented in the sequence of a number of the lives of exemplary individuals. This is Thomas Carlyle's great man theory of history transposed into economic thought. And I doubt either Will Durant or Robert Heilbroner would have explicitly endorsed Carlyle, but they nevertheless implicitly follow a Carlylean methodology. But another way to look at this is through the lens of one of the economists who is himself covered in Heilbroner's book, and that is John Maynard Keynes. So there's a very famous quote from Keynes that goes like this, quote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I am sure that the power of vested interest is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas," unquote. And I don't think that Heilbroner would necessarily disagree with that. It would be possible to derive from Heilbroner's approach and Will Durant's approach a great ideas theory of history, analogous to Carlyle's great man theory of history, as well as what I call the great cities theory of history in my episode on Ferdinand Gregorovius and his big work on the history of Rome. And this is approximately what conceptual history, Begriffsgeschichte, mentioned in my episode on J.G.A. Pocock, is about. All of these, great men, great ideas, great cities, and conceptual history, constitute distinctive regions in the conceptual mapping of history. But I'm not suggesting that Heilbroner's work can be reduced to Carlyle's method or some variation on a theme of Carlyle's method, like a great ideas theory of history. From the perspective of philosophy of history, Heilbroner's work, like that of Hermann Kahn, about whom I earlier recorded an episode, points to the expansion of historical consciousness in the future. In my episode on Karl Jaspers, I characterized Jaspers' work as bringing historical concepts to bear on the present. And the next step beyond that is to bring historical concepts to bear on the future. Every present is a past's future, and our present today was our future of yesterday. The churning, you could say, of the present is continually transforming the future into the present, and the present into the past. And somehow we need to make sense of how time is bound together in a larger whole, despite being strung out for us in a way that it's not all present for us. One of the great works of metaphysics of the 20th century was J.M.E. McTaggart's 2-volume, The Nature of Existence, in which he, as an idealist philosopher, he denied the reality of time. He's sometimes categorized as a personal idealist rather than an absolute idealist, but he's part of the British idealist tradition. But his particular focus was the unreality of time. But in his analysis of time, he furnished a few concepts that are widely used by philosophers, even those who don't agree with his account. So McTaggart distinguished what he called the A series of time from the B series of time. The A series of time is the series past, present, future. And the B series of time is the series of earlier and later, which I would prefer to call before, during, and after, because before, during, and after has a perfect one-to-one correspondence with past, present, future. And McTaggart argues more or less because facts don't change only in respect to the A series, that it's illusory and unreal. Obviously, that's an oversimplification. But so the A series and B series concepts of time are pretty familiar with people who study time. But McTaggart also postulated a C series of time. And in the second volume of The Nature of Existence, where he has his treatment on time, he writes, and I quote, "It is possible that whenever we have an illusory experience of a time series, we are observing a real series, and that all that is illusory is the appearance that it is a time series. Such a series as this, a series which is not a time series, but under certain conditions appears to us to be one, may be called a C series," unquote. This, in some senses, resembles Plato's poetic formulation of time as the moving image of eternity, which I quoted in my episode on philosophy of history before Augustine. But we should probably distinguish between eternity and McTaggart's conception of a C series. Now, while we don't find any elaborate analysis of time like this in Heilbroner, the point is that time, however we do conceive of it, is a whole that requires a uniform methodology that applies equally to different times. In McTaggart's A series, we find ourselves in the present, looking back at the past and looking forward into the future. In McTaggart's B series, relationships of before, during, and after are eternally true. A contemporary philosopher might prefer to say that they are tenselessly true, so that there is no past, present, and future, but there are still temporal relations between separated times, some of which are early and some of which occur later. In McTaggart's C series, there is some non-temporal order that is the reality behind the appearances of both the A series and the B series. In all of these analyses, time is comprehended as a whole, and this means that principles that are applicable to any one time, whether a past or future time, or an earlier or a later time, are applicable to other times. Even if we attempt to avoid the metaphysical entanglements of the kind that interested McTaggart, conceptualizing the past is the first step outside the eternal present of naive cognition. This first step was taken in antiquity. We could say it was taken by Herodotus, if we like, though the conceptualization of the past remains incomplete and imperfect in our time, more than 2,000 years later. Conceptualizing the future is another great leap beyond our naive immersion in the present, And this began only very slowly with the scientific revolution and experienced its inflection point in the 20th century. We can find intimations of this development early in the 20th century. The French, or Belgian, I should say, historian Henri Perrin gave a definition of history, the development of human societies in space and time, that does not explicitly invoke the past. Of course, there's no consensus among historians or philosophers of history on a definition of history, but Perrin's definition is unusual insofar as it represents a higher level of abstraction and generality than is usually to be found in definitions of history. It also offers an opportunity to justify the extension of historical methods to include the totality of time, past, present, and future, within the proper scope of history as defined by at least one prominent historian, by which I'm still speaking of Perrin. Heilbronner was among those who contributed to the extension of historical methods to the study of the future, along with futures like Hermann Kahn, who I discussed in a similar vein in my episode on him. In addition to Heilbronner's books on economics, he also wrote a couple of books that take what we could call an historical view of the future. The Future is History and Visions of the Future. The Future is History was originally published in 1959. Visions of the Future came much later in 1995. And he also wrote other relevant works and occasional pieces that could be roughly characterized as futurism. In his book, The Future is History, subtitled The Historic Currents of Our Time and the Direction in Which They Are Taking America, Heilbronner postulated that a new conception of history appeared with modernity. And he wrote, I can't find the passage that I marked. With the change in the reality of mankind's situation, there came as well a new conception of history itself. Previously, as we have seen, the word mainly connoted to its contemporaries the course of the dynastic and military, the political and personal fate of the heroes of society. What lay beneath this pageant was deemed essentially uninteresting, unhistoric, except insofar as the masses responded to stimuli from above. But now the meaning of history changed in the consciousness of those who were experiencing it. In a very real sense, society discovered itself. The content of history, which is to say, the matters that concern those who were thoughtful about history, expanded to include aspects of human life which had never before merited the historian's glance. The thing I want to see, wrote Carlyle in the first flush of this new perspective, is not red book lists of court calendars and parliamentary registers, but the life of man in England, unquote. What Heilbronner is writing about in this passage is the rise to dominance of social history, which I have discussed in previous episodes. And surprisingly, he quotes Thomas Carlyle in a surprisingly un-Carlylean moment, reflecting not on the great men of history, but on the life of the ordinary man in England. Even Carlyle, it seems, was not immune to the influence of social history, which was only to grow after his time. And even though Heilbronner implicitly followed Carlyle's methods in his history of economics, we can see that his interest is not in great men, but in the great forces that shape history. Heilbronner connects the new history to other manifestations of modernity besides social history. In particular, he highlights the role of optimism about the future, the hope for a better tomorrow, belief in progress, and how historical forces seem to take on a life of their own. Heilbronner's association of a new conception of history that is primarily social history, and moreover, social history inflected with hope, optimism, and progress, points to an interesting contrast of perspectives on history and modernity. In my previous episode on wars and rumors of wars, I quoted Hannah Arendt on the emergence of mass man in history, and how she saw this emergence of mass man as constituting a definitive break in history between the traditional past and the modern present. Heilbronner also sees a discontinuity in history between the old history of tradition and the new history of modernity. In his Visions of the Future, he wrote of the past, "Throughout the vast extent and varied forms of the distant past, religion serves as a consolation for a changelessness that is beyond reach or hope in its earlier societies, or as a warning against violating codes of behavior, which in all later societies preach the acceptance of things as they have always been and must always remain." And in the same book, later in the same book, of the Future, he writes, "The forces that have established the differences of yesterday from the distant past and still shape today's world will continue to exercise their role tomorrow. Hence, rather as in the case of the distant past, we are assimilating that the conditions of the present will be the dominant realities of what is to come. More to the point, our task rests on the assumption that one can make reliable pronouncement about the feasibility of efforts to control the forces of change themselves," unquote. Here we see not only the idea of a rational scientific grasp of forces shaping the future, but also the possibility of human agency in controlling these forces. Heilbronner's conception of social history is, in a sense, Arendt's mass man seen through a more optimistic lens with the possibility of human agency shaping the future. Hannah Arendt connects the appearance of mass man with totalitarianism. Heilbronner connects the masses whose story is that of social history with scientific predictability and foresight, in which the historical forces unleashed by modernity give us insight into the future that is not prophecy or divine illumination, such as the mode of representing the future in past societies. Heilbronner sees a cautious and skeptical optimism in Adam Smith's vision of a rationally comprehensible economics. So once again, to refer to his The Future is History, he wrote, quote, "Optimism, despite its celebration of personal striving, does not reject the idea of the future as history. Rather, it stems directly from an historic view of the future. Indeed, it is difficult to conceive of an optimistic philosophy which does not draw its faith from the ongoing momentum of historic forces. What optimism does assume about the future is not an absence of historical influence, but a congeniality of influence. Or to put it differently, a philosophy of optimism assumes that the direction in which we seek to venture as the heroic steersman of our destiny will be compatible with the currents and tides set in motion by history's impersonal forces," unquote. Both Arendt and Heilbronner are considering the future of mass man, but for Arendt, it is a future of men in dark times. I believe that's a title of one of her books or essays. While for Heilbronner, it is a future pregnant with hope if we align ourselves with the forces of history. That is to say, Heilbronner had his own idea of what constitutes being on the right side of history, something that I discussed in my episode on James Fitzjames Stevens. And for Heilbronner, it entailed optimism, hope, and progress. Heilbronner's work points to the need for an historiography of the future, situating the future as part of history and as a legitimate object of knowledge for the philosophy of history, as well as adjacent conceptual engagements with history, what I have called other spots on the conceptual map of history. Heilbronner begins this process of historicizing the future, and others have contributed to the same process in various ways, but the bulk of the work remains undone. It could be argued that speculative philosophies of history to date have always thematized the future. But the way in which speculative philosophy of history has been widely repudiated in recent years implies that there are no analytical or formal philosophical problems in thematizing the future as a part of history, or you could say philosophically thematizing the historical future or the deep historic future. That, or the implication is that it is simply not worth doing. Given that little or no work has been done on this, it may well be the perception of the futility or lack of interest in such a pursuit. But the field is wide open for those who would like to claim it as their own. So happy birthday, Robert Heilbronner, and thanks for listening.